name is Chancellor Makanjuola. I'm the social media ambassador for I-House, and I'm here today with both Nancy and Steve as part of our I-House Generations interview discussion, as well as like a talk. We've been planning this at I-House for some time because we want to look through the history of I-House residents and the family members who have lived there. And so we heard that you, the Tivol family, has been part of probably the longest I-House resident generations that we've had, at least one of them. And so it's great to speak with you both here today. So if you don't mind, if you want to describe a little about yourself and your family history and what brought you to I-House.
Well, I looked it up, and we started on both sides of Steve's dad's side and mine. He had an aunt who was there the year it opened in 30-31. My father was there in 31-32. My mother in 33-34. Another aunt-in-law in early 40s because she was there the day Pearl Harbor was bombed. And then we go to the early 60s where I had a brother-in-law and a cousin who were there in the early 60s. And I was there all of 66 and half of 67. And Steve, what was your year?
91, 92, and 92, 93.
Okay, so we had, I went because my parents had talked about their great experience, even though it had been 30 years before. And I went in my senior year because Americans, at least at that point, had to be senior. And I was there for a year and a half, the second half of my senior year and the first year of grad school.
And what about you, Steve? Describe yourself.
I did a couple of years in the dormitories, and knew a little bit about I-House, but not a whole lot. But it was a very interesting group of people. Certainly, that was one of the reasons that I was going there. The food was better. I wouldn't say restaurant quality great, but it was certainly a lot better than the standard dorms. But yeah, it was a lot of really interesting people and a lot of interesting things going on. So it was an easy call to say, could I get in my junior and senior year?
Mm-hmm. And since you said you kind of didn't know that much about I-House going in, with your mom Nancy, how much did you tell him, or how much, Steve, did you learn from your mother's experience going in about what I-House would probably be like compared to I guess how it was when you actually got there?
Didn't get a whole lot of stories about the house itself or about those sorts of things, but a lot of the a lot of how I grew up, I think, was influenced by it, or at least in similar ways. My father had been in the Foreign Service. My folks had been overseas. We'd get letters with really funny looking stamps at Christmas time and fun letters. People would come and visit us. So I had a sense that there was, a world outside of the United States, thank you. Grew up in a town where there were many different languages spoken in my kindergarten class. And folks, I grew up to appreciate a lot of that. Here's something new and different. Let's try that. As opposed to here's something new and different. Ugh, what's that? So I sort of grew up with some openness to that to begin with, which was great.
And same for you, Nancy, kind of your impressions going in. So you said that your parents, but did both of your parents live there? So did they ever describe what their I-House experience was like, or what do you know about their time at I-House? If you could.
I didn't know as much. I don't think there were as many activities. They talked about the people they met and how it really opened their eyes. My father read more than anybody I've ever known, and it was always about histories and other countries and different cultures. So he was, I think on the right track before he ever got there. And my mother too. And then they always loved to travel. And I guess not before I was at I-House, but soon after, they spent 20 years going all over the place and meeting friends and inviting the people back and having their children come. And even when I was at I-House, I grew up in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. So, we would take the streetcar back and I'd bring people for the weekend and we'd have parties and, host people who hadn't seen much of San Francisco or been out of I-House. So they were always very welcoming and they would talk about their time. But again, mostly not so much about the activities because I think we had much more by the time I was there, but talking about different people and their perspectives and learning about their countries and their background and how other people perceived what was going on here.
Amazing. And so, and they were there in the 40s, correct?
30s, in the 30s.
Oh, the 30s. Okay, so that was kind of basically when the starting decade of I-House.
Yeah. I mean, my father was there, I think, the second year, and it was an aunt who was there the first year, and my mother was, I guess, the fourth year.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but your mother was there when Prohibition was repealed.
Oh, yes.
So that was a fun one.
I tell them that story. All right.
Please.
Even in my day, we had a men's section and a women's section.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother even told this story at a Sunday supper when all of us were there, my parents and Steve. And so when the night Prohibition was repealed, the I-House provided more security in the men's section, because even when I was there, there was no liquor allowed within 1 mile of the campus. So you could go in any direction and know exactly when you were a mile away, because it would be liquor stores.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So they didn't want, the men to get too drunk. Well, my mother brought a suitcase home and brought quite a few bottles back, and the women at I-House, and the night Prohibition was repealed, had a wonderful time.
So the men and women's sections were still divided, correct?
It was. I think that changed around Steve's time. And also what's changed when I went back to visit was the food. I mean, both of us said at the time we were there, it was better than the dorm food. But now, oh my goodness, it's like not an international restaurant, a whole bunch of them. I mean, it's exceptional with a restaurant chef and planning all these meals. When I was there, it was men's and women's section, and I think, Steve, you were there when they transitioned?
When I was there, it was co-ed with a couple exceptions. There was a little wing on the 3rd floor that had a very different look to it, so it was called the hospital wing. That was all women. The 8th floor was all men's, and that got some fight to it, because it's got the beautiful rooms with the big windows and the bay facing, stuff. But because it had only the one bathroom, and they didn't do co-ed bathrooms in my day, it had been all men. And I remember there was a woman there who was super upset about this and was fighting for it. And I just think so fondly of the moment she was talking with the director about making the floor co-ed or only women. And he offered, well, why don't we, we could take turns, right? Well, we'll have alternating men's and women's on the 8th floor. And she said, that's great. It's been men's for 60 years, so it can be women's for 60 years, and then we can talk about how we'll switch back and forth. And it was just so funny to watch him go from, oh, good, you're listening to my suggestion, to, oh, no, that's not at all what I meant.
Oh, my gosh. So I didn't even know that. And so during your time in the 90s, so who was the executive director, if you remember, like during both of your times while you were there?
Mr. Warwick, Sheridan Warwick, was the director for a long time before I got there, and subsequently as well.
And I was there when Joe Lurie was the director.
Yeah, we actually, I talked to Joe Lurie too. He's going to be on another interview as well. But kind of going back to the different activities that were there. So I think one of the main things, Sunday supper is always was a mainstay, definitely at I-House. So if you could describe your experience, kind of like attending some of those, if you got a chance to, and what were some other favorite activities or that you got a chance to participate in?
Well, I went, I think, probably every Sunday supper. And there was always a very interesting speaker, but it wasn't just limited to Sundays. I was there in the 60s, so that was a very interesting time. We'd already been through most of the free speech movement a couple of years before, but this was civil rights and then the beginning of anti-war. So Joan Baez sang in the library, and Kissinger came for a talk, and there were other politicians who came. So it was really very interesting. And the other thing that I remember was I don't know what you would call it, international festival, where groups from different countries or regions put on a show.
Yes.
And I was in charge of what are we going to do for the Americans? Well, Joan Baez had just sang, so we can't, outdo her in folk songs, which would be the obvious one. But I noticed that there was a program where there were about 40 German lawyers who came. And they all love Westerns. This was the big thing. They grew up with Westerns. So we put on a silent movie in very slow motion. And we had honky-tonk piano in the background and a strobe light. It was in a bar scene, and the girls did the can-can dance, and the men played cards, and the bad guy, and all in very slow motion, pulled a car out of his pants. And then they had a big fight, and the sheriff came in and shot the bad guy. Then there was a sign that said, sorry, film broken, must rewind. So we did everything backwards at speed, double speed, and reran the film. And that was a kick. So, but we had a very good time. We had to come up with something because people had beautiful costumes and dances, and what can we do? So we had a very good time.
And then what about you, Steve? What activities, if it was Sunday supper or other activities that you remember participating in?
I want to say that there were probably fewer, organized activities in my day. Sunday supper was, I think, once a term, and would go to that. It was always a lot of fun. And again, with shows and acts and things going on. And there were a lot of, less formal things going on. Coffee hour on a Wednesday night. We usually drew, a good half of the house. Movie night, which was always an interesting thing because we did world cinema, and you'd have, folks for whom a movie was in their first language would laugh a lot more than those of us reading subtitles. We had an unofficial social event of fire alarms because the fire alarm system was ancient at that point, and we had many times when we would find ourselves out in the street in the evening because someone had been smoking a cigarette or something else had set off this old system. And everyone comes out in their pajamas. And I want to say at one point in my stay there, the program fellows decided that they would just have a cart of cookies ready to go. And on their escape route, someone would go and get it because we got, it started getting silly that we were out there out on the curb so often.
I should have said, go ahead, sorry.
Also, there were a lot of residents throwing a lot of parties, which was a lot of fun. You used to be able to sneak out of the Gamble Lounge window out onto the roof between the Great Hall and the residence part of the building. And so there were many a fun party out there. Lots of folks, would either shut down a floor or have something going on in a part of a wing. And, people had a good time and were able to not only do a lot of studies, which was what was bringing a lot of folks, but also have a lot of exchange and a lot of, this would be a little different if I were at home kind of moments.
I think one of the things that we did at the time, given the state of the, current events of the time being anti-war and civil rights. So everybody crowded into the Great Hall to see the news every night. And one of my friends was getting his MBA, and he was from Northern Ireland. And he said, at least you talk about your problems here. We have problems and we don't talk about it, and one day it's going to explode. And as soon as he went home, then the Troubles happened in Northern Ireland for 30 years. And he actually got very involved in it and was eventually knighted by the Queen for what he did. And he and his family came and spent a summer here, when the kids were little. And so it was very interesting to see what was going on, because people would say, well, you're talking about what you have here, and we have this problem in our country, and we have this problem in ours, and we don't talk about it. Or if you talk about it, you may not be seen again. So it was very interesting to get people's perspective on what was going on.
And then I kind of want to ask you, Nancy, what was it like, especially since you said, given the context of the times, this was like, during like the war, like leading up to like the Vietnam War, and also like the civil rights era. So what was it like being in an intercultural residence at that time too, especially you have people there who were like fighting for civil rights, at least for like African Americans, and like you're living in a space with people from all around the world. Like what were some of the conversations that you were having with like your peers and residents there at the time, if you remember?
Oh, I do. And it was very interesting because I think, and not just because as my friends point out, I was raised in a liberal bubble in the Bay Area, but I think I-House was basically a liberal bubble at the time, because people who were bringing up problems, whether it was Northern Ireland or whether it was Nigeria and Biafra at the time, people in China and people in Vietnam. It was very, very interesting to hear what people had to say. There were very few disagreements, as I remember. Sometimes we didn't know enough about the problems in the other countries because, as we used to say, it was called World News Tonight, but it wasn't world news. It was America in the world as opposed to world news. So we were really getting an education in what was happening in other parts of the world. Very few disagreements, very few arguments. I think most people appreciated what was going on here and participated. I remember there were foreign students when they were assured, and probably by the staff, that if they participated in some of the protests, they were not going to be sent home. It wouldn't affect their, and they were probably counseled not to get arrested, but in most cases, they were participating and felt, I think, good about doing it and free to do it. And some of them said they couldn't be as free at home, depending what country it was and what the cause was. But there wasn't much disagreement. It was more their learning more about what was happening here And they knew a little bit more about it than we knew about what was happening in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that. I would say that sort of away from the pressures of home, a lot of folks were able to reach across boundaries that they might have experienced in their own countries. I remember a couple of friends of mine, one who was Iranian and the other who would tell you he was Persian. But they could get along and they could talk and they could, they were never hostile or upset with one another. They had very different opinions about what should happen, but they were able to be friends. I remember at the Spring Fest, there was a worry among some of the staff because the Greek and the Turkish Cypriots wanted to share a table. Mm-hmm. And, it's like, why wouldn't you go for that? That's such an I-House kind of a moment of, these people who at home would be at each other's throats, being able to sit down and say, here's our point and here's what we feel is right. And we can disagree and still be civil.
And we had, as I remember now, when you mentioned that, a woman from Israel who had been a lieutenant and in the army, and a young man from Egypt who had been a lieutenant in the army, and they became very good friends. And they both appreciated the fact that this was possible, and it wouldn't have been otherwise. They never would have met, let alone had the freedom to talk to each other and, cautiously get to know each other and then become very good friends.
Amazing. Yeah, it's so good to see like kind of the differences between generations, like going through like a war and up into your time. It's like after the Gulf War too. It was like just to see the kind of like current, like what was happening during the times too, like in current events, and like how I-House was kind of like a safe bubble away from that, it seemed.
And I think, to be honest, I don't think too many Americans would want to live there if they didn't have an interest in other parts of the world or in meeting other people. So maybe it wasn't a broad cross section of students, but it's still Berkeley. So even when I was applying for college, I think Santa Barbara had just opened, and parents who were probably more conservative than mine always thought that Davis was such a nice campus to go to because it's isolated and safe and you can ride your bike, and the same with Santa Barbara. But Berkeley was the place to be, and I think it still is. In fact, I'm going to be driving, helping to unpack a young girl into the dorm on Saturday. So, and she's looking forward to it, even though it's going to be virtual for a while.
Yes, yeah, we have to deal with a virtual I-House, I guess, for this fall too, even though unfortunately it has to close, but we're still trying to keep the spirit alive there as well. And yeah, I also wanted to get, so like kind of going back to the other generation. So overall, you said there was at least, or I guess I'll ask you this: how many people in your family have lived at I-House?
Well, I'm trying to think from Steve's side.
So I know 7.
Okay.
My mother and her parents each, and then my uncle and my father's 2 aunts, both one on his mother's side and one on his father's side.
And you have,
so I know 7. And
Bill,
me.
And Bill, yeah. And Dan. So that's 9 of us.
Oh, Dan. Okay, Dan's on your side. All right. No, but yeah. Bill I counted. Okay. I think that's 8.
And do you ever talk about all together? Have you ever shared your experiences with them as well? Kind of like, oh, well, this is how my time was at I-House versus like compared to yours. Do you ever like kind of compare it as well?
Well, I did with my parents at the time. I think also because I brought so many people home, to stay at our house on the weekends or during some breaks, and they came to I-House. And one of my husband's aunts, one was in the State Department, so we talked to her when we lived in Washington, and the other one lived in Annapolis and her husband had been in the Philippines, and I know she started an international welcome group to welcome international students and their wives in Annapolis.
Amazing. My next question is, well, like one thing about living at I-House, you get to like obviously like learn about other cultures, meet people you probably have never met before. And so I kind of wanted to know what were some, I guess, cultural differences that you noticed when you were living at I-House, like among the residents that you kind of picked up on.
I'll say one of the interesting things for me was not so much about where they were from, but sort of what attitude they brought. I know the folks who came to I-House looking for something new and different and open to the experience had wonderful times there. And then we would have the occasional person who was like, I expect this to be just like it is at home, but in a different place. And they were never happy, because it wasn't going to be just like home, and they would find all sorts of things to complain about. And they usually didn't, stay too long. But it did give me pause to think about, what my assumptions were and to think about how other people would see things, and to really kind of hammer home the notion that just because that's the way I'm used to it doesn't mean that that's the way it needs to be or is. And some very, interesting conversations over breakfast. I remember a gal from Haiti talking about, with it being hurricane season, that they always pray that it will hit Florida. Not so much because they don't like Florida, but because they know the United States is, and if it hits the U.S., people will be taken care of. And if it, hit in her home, it was a lot less likely. These are the sorts of perspectives that one can miss out on just completely living in the United States.
And I think I mentioned to you, Chancellor, before that I made a very good friend from Nigeria. And he first went to Vanderbilt. And so this would have been in Tennessee in the mid-60s. And somebody was an entomologist, and somebody told him, you're going to the South in the 60s. And it's probably better for you to be identified as an African than it is to just be another Black student. So they told him he should buy a couple of African robes, which he had never worn in his life. But he wore them. He had 2 for every day, and he had a fancy one. And when I got married, he wore his fancy one to our wedding. But he said in Berkeley, he had to go buy some clothes because he couldn't, he bought some jeans because he didn't have to wear the robes all the time. So it was an experience for him as well. And this was at the time of the, I guess, almost civil war in Nigeria, because when he went back, he went into a civil war. So, he had a different experience here. He had a different experience at home. And he was also a wonderful cook and made some of the best meals I've ever had. So it was to see their perspectives of different parts of America and different parts of their own homeland as well.
Wow, it's definitely amazing to hear, like kind of how like it's kind of expanded your knowledge of like other people too. And then while you were there, what do you hope that some of the residents learned, or like the peers or people that you were living with, if you had a roommate or something, like what do you hope that they learned about you, if there's anything of your background that you shared with them too, for students that were trying to, I guess, get a sense of American culture or Bay Area culture, or since you grew up in Berkeley or like the San Francisco area, like what do you hope that you were able to share with others?
Well, I think one of the main things is there are Americans who care enough to learn about other parts of the world, and we're not completely self-centered. And some of them actually said that they didn't think Americans knew anything about the rest of the world or cared about it at all. And I think this was something that we could show, that there were at least some people that they could meet who were interested in them, interested in their country and their culture, and cared at all.
Yeah, along those same lines, the joke that I heard one breakfast, what do you call someone who can speak 3 languages? Trilingual. And someone who can speak 2 languages is bilingual. And people who can only speak 1 language, those are Americans. So the notion that America wasn't just the media or the news or the noise that they were getting at home, but that there were all sorts of things like, decent beer to drink in the United States, which surprised a lot of people. That there were, a range of opinions about foreign policy, that there was, people who understood that the United States was not the only country in the world. Thank you very much. It was funny. I would say that I grew up critical of a lot of the things that were going on in the United States and looking for ways to better it. But at my time at I-House, I found myself defending it a lot more than I ever had, simply to just, as host in part, but also to say, yeah, here's the problem, but also here's the piece that it has some promise, or here's the piece that's been outstanding, or here's the piece that we would still hang some pride on. Thank you very much. So some of that too.
And I think one of the things that I always, one of my pet peeves, we lived in Sweden when Steve was an infant. He was 3 months old when we moved there. And in Sweden, everybody gets a 6-week minimum vacation. So in July, schools, factory, hospitals, everything closes for the month, and everybody goes off and has a good time, and then they can take 2 weeks some other time. So we had a Swedish baby buggy, because with the cobblestones, if you use the American ones, you'd bounce the kid to death. So people would come up to me, the American tourists, and because I had a Swedish baby buggy, so they assumed I'm Swedish, and would yell in my ear loudly and slow, "Do you know where the NK store is?" And I would say, yes, go 3 blocks straight ahead, turn left, it'll be on the corner. And then they would say back to me, you speak English very good. And it took all of my willpower to say, no, I speak it very well. So I was determined when I travel, and I loved, I mean, that's one of the things both my parents and reinforced with I-House. I just love to travel, and I would take a big trip, at least one every year. And I was determined to at least say hello, goodbye, thank you, in whatever language it is, so I never have to say, do you speak English? You know, it doesn't take much to just, you know, learn a few phrases. And then people would say, oh, you start to speak to you, and you speak whatever it is so well. I know, no, that's it. But, you know, I can still do some in some languages. And it really gave me, it reinforced what my parents gave me, a real desire to see the rest of the world. And I told Steve, I think I'm almost done my bucket list. And he said, you better fill it up so you don't have to kick the bucket. So I have to find out where else I want to go now.
Well, it's not always as easy as all that. I remember we had an evening where we reduced one of our friends to tears. She was trying to teach us, you know, she was laughing so hard. She was trying to teach us how to say, you know, use tonal vowels. She was Thai. And so she said, you know, E, right? And growing up with a tonal language, we were, you know, many of us were just, you know, we would try it and she would just laugh and laugh and laugh at how bad we were.
Yeah.
Because for her, they were really different sounds. And for us, we just couldn't make it bad.
In China, I learned you say the word ma, depending what tone you give it. It can be mother, rope, horse, or a swear word. And our guide said, you better get it right so you don't swear at your mother. And we had friends from Sweden. And we had a babysitter for the kids when the parents went out. And Steve was about 5 or 6. So the babysitter had to learn, and she still remembers how to say "mom's coming soon" in Swedish.
Oh.
So we had lots of visitors from all over, and I think the kids grew up with that as well. And I think that was a good thing for them.
And so kind of, and since you've mentioned like the travels that you've had too, and I just also wanted to know, like, since leaving I-House, what impact has, or do you feel that it's had on your life, if any?
Well, I think it really made me want to see more of the world. And I did. I mean, I have, and I'm, you know, I've been traveling for 15, 20 years and more since I retired. And it's just fascinating to me to see how other countries have changed and what are they dealing with now. And when I look for a trip, I look for not just, I mean, I went to South Africa, but I waited to go to Africa. So I don't want to just go on a safari. I wanted to meet people and see things. And there was an opportunity to do that and go to people's homes and have discussions with politicians and reporters. And that's what I'm looking for. Not just to say I've been somewhere and I've seen, you know, the sights, but I think that came from I-House a lot. That I want to know the people, I want to know the culture, I want to know the problems as well as see the beautiful sights.
I would say that you know, I'm a teacher, and so it's helped me bridge that gap often with kids who are either from immigrant families or who have a different background, to just be sort of more aware of that, more onto that. And often I really surprise them as that funny old white guy who happens to know my food, or, you know, something from my country or something from my culture. And that's been a wonderful thing to continue to learn and to grow through that, to continue with connections with other people, and to be looking for some of those other things. And, you know, again, that sort of broadening of just because this is the way we do it and we're used to it doesn't mean it's the only way it can be done. To keep your eyes open for some of these other options and other ways of doing things.
And getting back to the people in your family who have lived there, what led to so many of them coming to live at I-House versus other residences, dorm residences, or spaces like at Berkeley?
I know from my parents. My father, it was the first or second year it opened, and he, as I said, always his whole life read, and mostly history and culture. So he said that was the place to go. Anyway, and my mother, I think the same thing. I think she always, my grandmother was the only grandparent who wasn't born in California or born in America. But during, this was even before that, they always welcomed immigrants and helped other people. And I think that my mother just said it was nice to meet some people from, you know, other places. California was not quite as diverse in those days as it is now. And she kept up for many, many years with some of the people that she met, and visited some overseas.
And so, and to your extended relatives, it seems like Cal is basically a huge part of your family too. Like people attending like UC Berkeley and then coming to live at I-House.
Well, I think one entered the Foreign Service. The other one started a club in Maryland to welcome foreign students and their families. And
yeah, I would say on both sides, the family is mostly from San Francisco. Cal was the place to go, and so many folks did. Not all of them came to the I-House, but that's all right. I know that my great aunts, one I think was just interested in the notion of that sort of exchange. The other was very involved in political science and politics, and then had a career in the State Department. Was part of the Reconstruction government in Japan after she was done with college. It was a real interest. I think my uncle had heard of it, and so he applied. He was a physicist, not as as interested in international relations particularly, but knew he could land there.
And my cousin became a professor, so of Near Eastern religion and languages and cultures. So I think if you're drawn there, you're in most cases interested in people and different cultures, different countries, and what better place to be. Great. And even places that we thought we knew. I had a friend from England and the one from Northern Ireland, and I didn't know much about Northern Ireland. And we still didn't, because our news just said how many people were killed after he went back, over 30 years. But we didn't really get any in-depth knowledge, because that's one thing we have to actually work to get, is real world news. So I usually watch the foreign newscasts, and then I get something.
And did you ever come to visit Steve when he was at I-House?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And what were some of the differences that you noticed, like when you came to visit him versus when you were there?
I don't know, because we usually would come on the weekend and go to the football games or take him out to dinner. So, I don't know about the activities, but my parents and I did go to one Sunday supper when he was there. All four of us. So I don't know how many differences there were. The house looked the same. The building looked the same.
Not anymore. I don't know if you've been back anytime soon, but the big renovation project that they did is outstanding. In my day, they still did not have wired access for computers because it wasn't a big deal yet. And that's certainly changed up. I will say that, physically the house is looking great. And I will say I also, with a couple of friends from my era who are still in the Bay Area, we went to coffee hour once or twice in the last few years. And it's funny. I had this experience of, wait, I know that person. No, I don't. I don't know any of these people. And yet, so much of it is still very much the same. There's that same energy and same liveliness to it. There's that same sense of exchange. And it's still a warm and wonderful place. And even though I am now far too old to pretend I can mix in, it's still just delightful to come by and see.
One of the things that I think that the American students did when I was there is to get the foreign students who might have been a little hesitant to get more involved in campus activities, out of I-House, just to see what was going on. I like sports. I would always take people to a game. Just to get out so that they could broaden their experience, because, they're still there and they're studying like crazy. But, I was 3 years before I got there in regular campus activities. And I think it helped for us to encourage the foreign students to get more, or at least to see what was going on, if not get more involved.
Now, that said, the international houses, when I was there, always had great intramural sports teams. The soccer team would all talk to each other in Spanish. The street hockey team, usually in Canadian accented French. And I'm trying to remember what their other team was. Is it
rugby?
All the time. No, they didn't do IM rugby, but yeah, you get these folks together, and it was just, yeah, of course we're going to play, and we're going to be able to talk about what's going on, so the other folks don't necessarily understand us, which got them in trouble with the occasional referee who did understand them. But it was a lot of fun.
Wow. And Nancy, you also decided to participate in this spring's I-House Resident Council match. If you can describe a bit about your involvement there and being a donor, or why you wanted to help participate in the Big Give fundraiser.
Well, in fact, I was going to be out of the country. I was going to be in Mexico on the day of the fundraising, the match. So I called Joy before I left and said, can I give you my information ahead of time, because I don't want to I used to have to raise money to fund our nonprofit, and I don't want to pass up a fundraising activity day. And she said, well, can we use your money to match? I said, as long as you think you'll get it, I don't want it to go to waste. So, you know, as a fundraiser who had to raise all the money to fund this nonprofit, I appreciated what she was doing. And so I got involved that way because I didn't want to pass up the time to do the money. And I give to Cal, but I have it directed to I-House because I think it's such a wonderful experience. And it really is an eye-opener for Americans and for foreign students, just to experience each other and to experience America and to learn more about other parts of the world that is often harder for us because we just, you know, how often can I learn about Nigeria or Sudan, I'm trying to think, or even Northern Ireland, which is, you know, speak English, sort of. I can understand most of it, and we still kid Desmond of some of his pronunciations, but I didn't know anything about it. And I, you know, read the newspaper and listened to the news, and it's very hard because we're so focused on, you know, international news that involves America. Even when we watch the Olympics, it's not the Olympic Games in most cases, it's Americans at the Olympics. So we have to work a little harder to get that international perspective.
Yeah.
I have to say, given the fundraising piece, I got an earful from some friends of mine. I was on the I-House Council as one of the student representatives to the board of directors. So I knew the council, worked with council when I was there. And so my friends were like, I don't know. Steve's mom has put this up. I bet Steve's put her up to it. I'm like, really? Didn't know.
No, I didn't even know he was there. So that's up to him.
So yeah, you said, so you were on resident council when you were there in the 90s, correct, Steve?
Yes.
Oh, wow. And were you on resident council?
I was.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
What inspired you to be part of it?
I got drafted. The American who was there said she had to do something else. It was something for her grad school, I guess, prepare for her orals. And so she said, I can't do it. You should do it. So, okay, I did it.
And then Steve, what was your involvement in I-House Resident Council? Were there any policies that you kind of like helped to change or push for change during your time there as being part of the resident council? I mean, you mentioned like the girl who said she wanted the all women's floors too, or switching turns, but I guess that was more like a higher level, executive level But in terms of what your time at resident council, like what were some things that you did there?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of that belongs in this particular interview, but yeah, there was a feeling from many of the more involved residents that the house had moved from a really resident-focused administration to one that was much more worried about the bottom line, in part because the house had been in a fair amount of financial trouble and wanted to maintain its independence. But there was a lot of mild unrest from students. So we were working on several different things. A workable alcohol policy was one that we were trying to get going because what they had on paper was unenforceable. But there were a lot of odd and funky things that we were sticking our nose into.
And I think part of it has to do with finances, because I know from someone in the fundraising part of Berkeley itself that when I went, well, when my parents went to Cal, it was $20 a semester. When I went, it went all the way up to $50. And it wasn't, we were not allowed to call it tuition. It was called incidental fee. But in that time, I was told, in my day anyway, 83% of the costs of the university came from the state. And from what I understand from this young man, when I met him 3 years ago, it was 13%, and now it's 10. So they're also dealing with a lot more money to raise, people who have to pay a lot more for tuition, especially foreign students and out-of-state students, let alone, the cost of living. So I think the whole idea of money and the lack of it being provided from the sources when we were there creates a lot more, many more challenges.
Yeah, $50 a semester sounds pretty unheard of at this time.
Well, when we came over to visit Steve when we went to a football game and picked him up, I took his younger brother to the ASUC store and bought him a sweatshirt. And a woman tapped me on the shoulder and she said, "You look about my age. Did you go to Berkeley?" Yes, I did. She said, "Do you remember when our incidental fee was less than that sweatshirt you just bought your son?" And I said, "Yes." For one semester's worth, I got him a sweatshirt.
Wow. And so I only have a few more questions left too, but kind of in terms of your family history at I-House, do you hope that any future Tivols or future people in your family will come to live at I-House? And if so, I guess what have you kind of been telling them about your experience, if you have?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen. My granddaughter one of them is growing up in Berkeley, which means she may want to get away. But I would tell them and the other two, or tell her and the other two, that it's just an exceptional experience. It's really a unique experience. I mean, I don't know where else you could go to get this except the other I-Houses at the, sister places. But other than that, I don't know where you could meet so many people from so many different cultures, and have wonderful discussions and have wonderful activities and just have fun with people and broaden your own horizons, and you can help other people broaden theirs as well.
Yeah, I think I would echo some of that. I had a roommate from South Korea. He and his friends asked me, so where does one go to church? I said, well, it kind of depends what your faith is. We're a little taken aback. And then they let me know they were Christians. I said, great. Now, does that mean that you are a Catholic, evangelical, Protestant, which type of Protestant? Again, it took a minute. Well, where do you go? And I said, well, I'm Jewish, so I wouldn't be going. Really? There are Jewish people still in existence as opposed to just in the Bible? So you have to be ready for people whose experience is really different from your own, and you have to understand that you're going to be one of those people too, and be open and ready for those sorts of experiences, as opposed to put off by them or set back by them. It really is a great chance, not only to represent the United States, but also to really learn how different your point of view is from other folks, and that there are lots of right ways to do things.
One of my father's pet peeves was, he said, when social studies was invented, geography and civics and a few other things went out the window. So he invented games for us called Spin the Globe. We would have to find places. And I think there are so few people that have any sense of geography of the world, unfortunately not enough interest in it, who don't know where other countries are. We lived in Sweden. People thought we lived in Switzerland. And these were educated people who never had geography, never learned about people from other places, name more than 3 or 4 countries in Africa, have no idea of geography or different cultures. And I think that is so important. And it's one of the places to get that information, I-House, and to meet the people, from those places.
Amazing. And just to kind of transition to like my final questions too. So now that I-House unfortunately will be closed for the fall semester, I guess due to, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic and going into safety precautions, I guess, what were your thoughts when you first heard the news, and like, what are your hopes for I-House moving forward, if you have any?
Well, my first thought was, I guess the foreign students aren't coming, or they're afraid if they come, they can't go back. I mean, who knows? I think it would be very stressful, period. I have neighbors who are German, and the daughter goes to school in Germany because it's free and it's a wonderful university. And only because she has dual citizenship does she know that if she comes back here, she'll be able to go back to Germany. So I would assume that people who don't have that option, they don't know what's going to happen, and who knows what our government is going to do, and who was probably less sure before, and see after the election. But if you don't know if you can come, or if you can't go back, or what's going on, I think it's very iffy. So I think it's very unfortunate. At the same time, I can understand why it's happening. And I hope it's over soon, and that I-House will be back soon.
Yeah, likewise, I would say that it's another casualty of the times that we're living in, and some of the policies that we've sadly been following along. I look forward to it being able to reopen soon. I really hope that some of the online pieces that you're pushing for are able to keep some folks connected. That would not have been an option in my day. But one hopes that it's that people are smart and safe and are able to return to the house quickly.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I just want to ask, any like final thoughts or like final memories, or like one defining moment that you could probably name that kind of like shaped your experience at I-House when you were there? I
think for me, it was just the people that I met. mentioned before we started this interview that I met a woman from North Carolina, from a small town in North Carolina, who was old enough, she was probably older than my mother, because she was a teacher and she was here on a fellowship. And getting her perspective was, again, totally different. It was almost like a foreign country. She grew up in a very small, rural North Carolina town. So, and she's written a book about her experience in Berkeley. But I think just to broaden our perspectives about the rest of the world, and that, you know, every country has people with different opinions in that country, and so do we. And I think that was important for the foreign students to see here, and for us to get an appreciation of the rest of the world that I wouldn't have had otherwise. I really wouldn't, despite my parents and my father's great interest. But it's different when you meet someone from other parts of the world than just reading about it.
And for you, Steve?
Yeah, I don't know if I have just a single time or a single event. I will say that, you know, again, it's meeting these other people and talking with them, being able at a few occasions to go and then visit with some of these folks in their homes, and that's fun too. To get, you know, to not just have them be the representative of where they live in Berkeley, but then to actually go and see where they live and how they live. Is fantastic. I know now when I watch the World Cup or the Olympics or something, it's like, I know someone from that country now. I know somebody who's cheering for this. But yeah, I don't know if I have that one crystal moment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and do you have any? Do you still keep in touch with the friends? If you made friends there, do you still keep in touch with them to this day?
I do. After 1967 I left, so it's been a little while, but I still keep up with 3 or 4 people. And we visit, and they've come here, and
I don't keep up with enough of them, I'm afraid. When I left just before email really became ubiquitous, and so it was, you know, letter writing and trying to keep in touch, and I have not done my share of that, I'm afraid. But I do still run into some folks who are, you know, still in the Bay Area, which is a lot of fun for me. But also, very occasionally, I'm in touch with somebody from overseas.
And sometimes we find people. When we were at the consulate before Steve was born in Germany, one of the women who worked there said, "Oh, you went to Berkeley. You know, my daughter and my son-in-law both went there." And I said, "What's his name?" "Manfred." I said, "Oh my goodness," because we learned the first name in the country. We didn't bother with last names. I said, "Manfred from Germany. I know Manfred from Germany." So there are different places where, and so he came for dinner, and we became good friends for the year, and still keep in touch. But you know, you can run into people, and where did you live, and where did you go to school, and oh, I know somebody. And having the what do you call it? The directories with the pictures. And my year has been, I couldn't find it. And my year now has been scanned, and you can go anywhere. We had this area where I am now used to be the best fruit orchard in the country before high tech. And there was still one last apricot and cherry orchard. And the woman who owns it, her boyfriend, he looked at me and said, "We look familiar." He was from France. He went to I-House when I was there. You know, so I go to buy fruit and I find somebody from I-House. Wow. So you never know. You never know when it's going to happen.
That I-House connection.
Changed a little in 50, 60 years, but you know, we still recognized each other.
Amazing. Well, it's been so great talking to both of you and getting a chance of perspective of hearing your times when you were there in the 90s, when you were there in the 60s, seeing that generational differences, but also seeing how things were still pretty much the same too, like what parts of like the I-House were still the same. That's great to hear. And also like learning about your family history and like the generations that were there, and who knows, perhaps the generations that'll come to probably stay at I-House will have a plaque that says "From the Tivols," like a history.
If we have any influence, we'll make it happen. But you know, we have free-spirited kids and free-spirited grandchildren, so who knows.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, thanks for doing it, Jen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing more news about this as the I-House pushes it out. That'll be great.